I was only working dope, by the way, as an angle to get into this gang. It was the Crips. I mean, you see me, so, I'm wearing the right color, I guess, today, but otherwise, I'm not the kind of guy that's going to go get jumped in. I need to approach the Crip gang members, street gang, with a different kind of unique approach. I said I was a big time drug dealer from South Texas that just got my source busted by the feds. I was brand new, so I got a lot of critical looks and questions, but I also presented as an opportunity as opposed to competition.
We spend a lot of time looking at where people end up. This show is about what happened on the way there. I'm Toa Bazidis, the founder of The Skin Deep in the End, and I want to bring you on a journey here. And I've sat with enough people to know that nobody gets there easy. In every conversation here, we get under the skin, exploring what life does to a person and what a person does with life. There's a great quote that I love, which is, "The purpose of life is to discover your gift. The work of life is to develop it. And the meaning of life is to give that gift away." This is about the work. It's about discovering your gift. It's about developing it and exploring how you give it away. What do we do with life? What does life do with us? It isn't always pretty, but it's always real. And hopefully it's useful for wherever you are in your point of your journey.
He burned out as a jazz musician, cut his hair, and became a cop. Then spent 18 months building real friendships with 51 men he was about to send to prison. As a decorated undercover operative and author of Life in the Fishbowl, Tegan Broadwater learned that the ability to move between worlds only means something when you're honest about what you carry home from them. Tegan Broadwater. Today, we get under the skin. I feel like you've lived, 5 lifetimes in one lifetime. And all your expressions and everything you're doing is just like an ultimate code switcher on some level. Code switcher meaning you can, code switch into this environment, then go into another environment, code switch into that one. And when you tell me that your dad was whimsical and changed every 2 years, it makes me think, like, is that where that began? The ability to move into new environments and adjust because you were moving so much?
It may be subconsciously, but man, it was tumultuous for a kid. And I'm an introvert. I wouldn't say I have the anxiety at the level of a lot of kids do today, but I was the kid that when you move to a new place would just shut up and sit in the corner till somebody came up to you, and you just hope it's a decent person when they do. And when you're in grade school, man, it takes you a couple of years to have good best friends and everything else. And then after that 2 years, we'd leave again. And I was an emotional wreck moving every time, because we would move 1,000 miles every time we moved. And if it weren't 1,000 miles, it may as well be, because, this is before internet and all that kind of stuff. So,
Right.
At best, I could beg my parents to, foot the bill for a long distance call here and there, but that never happened either. So I think it forces you, though. Sometimes it's not a decision I ever would have made, and I probably would be more of a homebody than I am now had I grown up and been able to decide whether or not I wanted to move to these different places. I also have favorite memories from different places that I haven't visited in a while, so I think it all attributes to that. My dad was in one particular vocation most of his career. He did take a little sidestep into entrepreneurship. That's been my weirdest thing, is that I do feel like I kind of follow in his footsteps in that, hey, no matter what the age, if he has something in front of him, he wants to go tackle it, he just does. And it was something that I think it just opened a door subconsciously to help me recognize that, hey, when you change your mind and you want to do it, just do it. There isn't any kind of a framework that you have to work through.
Because it seems like if you look at the chapters in your life, it's, musician, jazz musician, band, police detective, undercover. Then that came to an end. And now there's, you built a business now, security business. You got 80 plus employees. You have that. Plus you're making the music that you've always made, but you kind of come back to that, to creating that has important messages in it.
Right.
And you're kind of have this like entrepreneurial multi-hyphenate, creator, podcaster, business owner, entrepreneur. That just seems like, from the surface, from my research that I see. So then you're traveling every two. Where does the love for music come from? How did that happen? How did you get so good at music?
it wasn't necessarily in my family. I think they made a pass at music at some point through their high school years and stuff. But I think most of it was just growing up and listening to the records my dad had. He was a Beatles freak, and as I started getting into more and more music, he was extremely supportive. Both my parents were supportive, but he would even get into the music that I was into and take me to shows and stuff like that. And in that degree of supportive, or go to clinics where musicians were doing, demos and stuff like that. So, I think a lot of parents would look at that trajectory and say, I would love for you to be able to make rent every month. Maybe music isn't the way to go.
Yeah.
So I appreciated that aspect. He did put his 2 cents in and said, look, if you're going to go to school for music, which is what I ended up doing, he said, you should, have a minor in business or something, that it would just make sense. And now as a grown up, it makes even more sense, because he was treating it like, hey, you need a plan B in case this doesn't work. And my first half of my life, maybe even a little more, I was super hyper focused, myopic on what I was doing, to the extent that I would do it until I burned completely out, and then take a complete left turn, and then go completely hyper focused and myopic again. So when he suggested, hey, she can, minor in business, get some education behind you, I didn't even consider how advantageous it could be to have some business acumen underneath music and apply it to music. Because that was kind of my tendency anyway. We were in touring bands, and we got signed at one of the early South by Southwest shows, and so there's a lot of ways that I could have applied that kind of stuff back then. But I think that's also why, I don't know where this plateau hit, but it was after I built the business, which again is a business I have no business starting, so to speak, because I was an operator. I'd learned all this stuff through cop work and everything else, and then I started this private security and protection firm. We built that thing up, and then once I started hitting a skid there, I wanted to.
When you say skid, what do you say skid? What do you mean? Do you mean like a burnout or a fall?
Yeah,
or a
yeah.
What was a skid like?
Yeah, it wasn't a plummet. It was a burnout like everything else. The end of my undercover career was, just super stressful, and it was hard to think of anything else. And same with music. I mean, leaving music was like a whole life changer, but I ended up doing it a bunch more times. And what I didn't want to do is allow the burnout to throw the business away. So then I tried to figure out how can I keep this business surviving without me, which is kind of the premise anyway, as a good leader would want to be. That's kind of how you do. But I was more motivated when I kept feeling like I wake up on days and I don't want to do the work. That'll hyper motivate you to figure out, well, who do I know that can do this work as well or better than I can? And let me find that person and put them in a place where they can succeed. And then I'm not doing a disservice to the business. And only then did my mind start opening up and taking off in different directions, and people giving me ideas through, trying to sell the book into a movie or different things. I kept thinking, well, I would love to do that. And then I would love to write the music for my own documentary. I'd love to, to create some IP of my own and start a podcast and learn from other people. And then I was able to, for the first time in my life, tackle these passions at the risk of losing money. But, had I just stayed a musician, I don't know if I would even have access to the equipment and the people that I do, because of the rest of the lifetime that's happened. That experience is important. So now I feel like I'm just, I don't know if it's just serendipity or what, but I look back and now I'm financially stable, and I can say, hey, I really want to buy a new piece of equipment, or I really want to invest in doing this on the cast, or I want to travel to go interview this person or whatever. And I just do it. I mean, it's pretty phenomenal.
It seems you said you're like hyper focused. You get there. So you're hyper focused on music. And then in your 1987 Chevy, something happened, you burnt out, and then boom, change of plan. Then you did the undercover. You're successful at that. I mean, and that was transformative. Boom, something happened. You changed business. Plateau, you call it a skid, boom, change. Can you tell me about the moment when you knew that you were leaving music, that first chapter ending professionally?
Yeah, because that was a huge one. Because I had dreamt of being a professional musician since I was in grade school. A few different things hit, and it started giving me pause. A significant one was having my son, which is when you're gone a lot. Then even though I was doing regional stints and taking off, we'd do a little trek through Fayetteville and Shreveport and Oklahoma City, whatever, and I didn't want to miss a day with my son there, for one. But two,
that's with Holly, your wife.
No, so I met Holly when my son was 3. So this was
okay.
Had I met Holly, my wife, when I was still a musician with long hair, I don't think she would have looked twice. So it's also serendipity. She has her taste. So this was my ex-wife, and so I ended up having a child, and then was finding myself really burning out on just the touring scene. I kept thinking the touring is what I wanted to do, and during that era, there wasn't an opportunity to sit in your own personal studio and crank out music by yourself. It just didn't happen that way. So you had to have access to people and to big studios, and you're paying big studios $600 an hour. And it's just not reasonable to think, well, I want to keep writing music and cranking out music, but I don't want to tour. That wasn't even an option, in other words.
Yeah.
So I had some guys that used to come out and watch. I had a primary gig, and then when I was home, I would play with these other cats, and it was good extra money. It was a lot of fun, really good guys. And there was this group of cops that used to come out and follow us around when we would play locally. And I talked to these cops, and I was like, yeah, man, I'm thinking about kind of leaving the scene. It was the first time just uttering the words was kind of a manifesting the thought, because I had always suppressed that thought at every other turn in my life. So, and they're like, dude, you should totally become a cop. We looking for good people. And I'm just thinking, you're talking to me? I mean, this is skinny, long-haired nerd hair all the way down, and they're thinking, you can see that kind of potential in me, So I did some research, and I'd always spent most of my life being harassed by cops because I was the long-haired kid. I get pulled over.
Right.
They drag all my equipment out on the side of the highway and just leave it and tell me, see you later, if they didn't find any dope, which they never did because I wasn't a dope head. So anyway, I just didn't have a good experience there, but it sounded exciting. And so the more I thought about it, the more I kind of transitioned my mindset into what I could and couldn't do.
Like looking back now that you're been a police officer, what do you think they saw in you?
I think I had a perfect manner and empathy to be a cop, but I don't know that in the older school cop days that was necessarily something they were looking for. Modern day today, to have somebody that's even tempered, and hell, if you want to fight before we go to jail, fine, let's fight. I'll never take it personal, so I'm not going to go overboard. I'm going to enjoy the time, put the cuffs on, we're going to whatever, and it's all good, and we'll have a talk about how we can turn your life around. That's just the way I was because I was a musician and I was just kind of cool with people. I don't back then, I don't know. Cause back then, when I got on, it was still cool to say, I want to be a cop because I want to chase bad guys and put them in jail. I still see nothing wrong with that as long as you're, designating bad guys as bad guys, but it's almost politically incorrect now. So I don't know. I really don't, other than my temperament, which was just, I'm, personable and stuff like that, which is why I rode that into cop work, thinking from day one, I'm trying to figure out how I can start doing some undercover work. Cause I love the excitement of kicking down doors and all that. But I felt like I could fit into any environment because my friends up to that time, I was athletic and still doing, sports and stuff like that. So I always had jock friends and smoking section friends and art friends and whatever. I was just friends with kind of everybody. So maybe they saw that. I don't know. I don't know if they would have recognized that behind a drum kit. I don't know.
So was it, so you leaving music was you wanted to be with your son. You realized you had to be on the road all the time. So you knew that was coming, that was not going to work. And you didn't know what to do next. And then the cops mentioned that to you and you're like, I never thought of that. And then you started looking into it. And what was it that kind of drew you in? And more importantly, why did you choose undercover?
the biggest advantage I had about being so myopic is that when those came to a halt, the whole world was my next choice. Because there's so many people that have these little directions in life they take, and I'm going to build off of this. Now, I'll admit, I built off of everything I did, but I didn't contain myself to the point where I thought, okay, I'm a musician. What else can I do besides tour that's still in music, and end up saying I'm a music teacher or something?
Mm-hmm.
That's so small of a ceiling that when I had this dream and I thought of nothing else, once that dream was erased and I had to contemplate anything else, it was like amazing to try to think, man, I could do like a million different things. And the suggestion was such a 180 that I think that was half of the intrigue, is like, wow, if they think that I'm capable of, I barely even shot a gun before, so
Right.
I'm like, so I'm going to have to chop off all my hair and go through all this training, and they think that I could handle that. I certainly did. I had self-confidence, but obviously I didn't know one way or the other because I hadn't experienced it yet. So I think that's really what it was that helped me recognize that it's such a diversion that I thought it would be super exciting, which it was.
What was the moment in your undercover work where you decided to stop? What happened at the end of those 13 years? Like, can you walk me through that?
So learning undercover work is a gradual process, and there's very little specific training on it. At least there was then. They had some courses that the DPS put on.
Who's the DPS? Dallas Police Force.
I'm sorry, the Department of Public Safety, the state police for the Texas. So, I took and did some of the training that I could, but I was learning kind of on the fly because a lot of it was really just about thinking on your feet, staying calm. If you're getting an extra question or they're trying to push you and you're getting nervous or you're trying to push people into a deal, I found out I see how these cops are working, and I could perceive how cheesy it was. Some of these guys would, go out and do an undercover deal, and they do a buy bust and they bust them right there. And I was like, man, these people are stupid. I can't believe they buy that. So I just started learning more about how these cats acted as humans, and working around them for the first 3 years really helped. And then I started politicking to get experience in writing search warrants and doing some undercover work. Got the training, got the SWAT entry training, and then politic to start writing warrants on my patrol shift. After we got off shift, we worked in a real bad part of town. During the shift, when everybody's working, I would go out and make some buys or take an informant to make some buys, and I would scratch out the paper, take it to a judge. And by the time everybody got off work, we would earn overtime, gear up with a bunch of old expired SWAT gear, and jump into a beater van that barely made it around the neighborhood and go serve search warrants and take down smaller dope houses that narcotics wasn't really messing with because they're small. But it gave me a lot of experience and understanding the people and the circumstances. So I think by the time I really started working, by the time I did a deep cover operation, which is the rare part of what I did, is nearly 2 years working in a single role. It was emotionally exhausting. I mean, it was there's no being turned off ever.
Because you mentioned shifts and as undercover, to me seems like, oh, there's shifts. I don't realize. So is there a certain level when you're undercover and you have shifts, so you're going for a certain number of hours and you can go home, and then there's another level where it's deep cover where you're basically always on and you're not going to the police station and you're living that life?
Yeah, that's a good question, because there really is a distinction. I mean, when you get into a narcotics unit, you have usually a shift. If you have special circumstances where they have a need deeper into the night, they might flex your shift. Most 99.9% of the undercover work that happens in the modern era since the 80s is guys that go in and they'll do a couple of buys and then knock the guy down, because there are just so many complaints that police departments look at it as too much of a risk factor versus knocking down complaints from the public. They can go knock down a house or, send in a guy who speaks Spanish, make one particular deal. Everybody crashes in and busts him, and then they try to flip him for the source and all that kind of stuff. And a deep cover operation is when you're essentially living a different identity. You're assigned a different identity. You have a place that's designated as your home in that city. And I was the undercover in that operation. It started locally and then ended up halfway through the operation. I really was running out of resources because I was spending my entire team's amount of money on a daily basis. I was spending their monthly budget on it by day because I was moving my way up. And I was only working dope, by the way, as an angle to get into this gang because it was the Crips that I was infiltrating. And it was purposefully, I mean, you see me, so, I'm wearing the right color, I guess, today, but otherwise I'm not the kind of guy that's going to go get jumped in. I need to approach the Crip gang members, street gang, with a different kind of unique approach, which was part of my creative thinking, which is, I said I was a big time drug dealer from South Texas that just got my source busted by the feds. And so I was brand new. So I got a lot of critical looks and questions, but I also presented as an opportunity as opposed to competition.
How long were you on Fishbowl? Was deep cover? That's 3 years?
It was 18 months. So it was a year and a half.
A year and a half.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Where is the line for you between like your own identity and sense of identity? Like how, I mean, you mentioned that they have established a home for you. So do you have an apartment there? Then like, where do you sleep at night? Do you sleep in the apartment or can you actually go back into your own home with your own, because you had a son too, right? You had a son and I assume you had met Holly when your son was 3. So you were married with Holly then. So
right.
How do you live that life? How does that, and how do you demarcate the boundary of your identity between, what was your character's name? Your T. Cadell?
T. Cadell.
T. Cadell. That was your cover name, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then you get home and you're Tegan Broadwater or whatever your family calls you. How do you navigate that? What does that do to your psyche? How does that work? How do you manage that?
It's interesting. It's what makes this particular case more unique because most of the cases of this magnitude are guys that are work FBI or take the Joey Pistone cases or any of those things where those guys are sent away from home to another state and they live in this other state and then they visit home periodically. What was crazy about mine was that I lived in the same city that these fools were working in. And so if I was home with my family and going to the mall, we had to have a plan as to how we're going to deal with it when I see someone I know from the hood that comes up or whatever. It was super unique. So I had a house that was designated, right? But I also didn't want people to know where my house was. So it was kind of a catch-22 because as far as I'm concerned, if I'm really a big time supplier and I have a house in the city, I'm not taking these fools to my house. And if they say, where do you live? I say, where do you live? I mean, are we doing business or are we getting playing footsies here? So I have all these IDs and a place and all this stuff. But in reality, most of the time I would defer all that stuff anyway. Only a cop would say, I'll show you my house. Here's my ID. I swear it's who I am. Let's do a deal.
Right.
So most of my stuff was deflection. To answer your question in a more specific way, based on what I'd learned in getting better and better at working undercover, I created a persona that was practically Tegan with a little inserted sociopath in there. Because otherwise you've got all these weird backstories to remember and this and that and the other. So I felt like I want to be able to talk like me. I want to be able to bust their balls. I want to be able to do all the things that I do. I don't want to be in character to such the extent that I come home and feel like, get out of character. What am I trying to do? Play for a movie,
So you basically played yourself. When you say sociopath, you mean that you just don't feel any empathy, any feelings for other people, any remorse, you just were able to shut that off. That's what you added in.
I had to one to match theirs because one of the key things I learned about them is that they're really, a lot of these dudes, hey man, this is a cool dude. I could totally hang out with this guy, and and I did hang out with them. But once you start figuring out the sociopathic part where you cross them and then their anger takes them to launching rounds into somebody's head, that's a little different game. And they lose a lot of that sympathy and empathy and all that kind of stuff. So I had to compartmentalize what I was doing in order to continue to do it, only with the end game in mind, which was to originally clean up a certain neighborhood within a part of the city that part of the city was already bad and socioeconomically dilapidated. But there was a particularly violent area of that town, which is where I started. And my whole goal was, man, there's people in every poor neighborhood that are overridden by crime, that are committed by certain people who keep committing the same crimes over and over, but that can't be stopped because they dominate the area. But there's these other people who, if they weren't poor, they would move. But you can't say, hey, you're in this bad crime area and you're a grandmother raising 4 grandkids because, and your kid's in jail or whatever, and you're trying to make it. They can't just up and move. They've lived there for 50 years. So them not having a choice gave me purpose in taking down these dudes. And that's what I kept my focus on during the operation, was just remembering why I'm doing this and then keep it compartmentalized, which is why towards the end it became so insanely emotional.
Whoa. What you just said, it keep it insanely compartmentalized, and that's why it became incredibly emotional at the end. But you'd think if you're compartmentalizing it and you're bringing the sociopathic part into you, you're able to compartmentalize. You're able to keep the emotion separate. So what happened there? How did it confound into each other?
Well, ultimately, what happens is the AUSA says, hey, we're not taking any more cases on. We got to wrap this up. I'll give you a week to finish up these cases. And I had 51 Crips that were about to stand trial. So I had a massive case accumulated, but I was assimilating myself into this life to where, to as part of your other question without going backwards, is when I would go home and start talking weird or being emotionally distant or thinking about what I was needing to do because I couldn't share certain things, then my wife would, keep me in my lane and remind me of who I was, which was terribly important. But by the end, when you're doing a roundup, we got 250 some officers stuffed in a high school gymnasium talking about where they're going to scatter and go take all these people down. It starts to hit you like, wow, this is going to be done. Because I started to just feel like this is sort of my life now. And I've gotten to know some of these people, and the compartmentalization keeps you from making the association emotional. It keeps you thinking, man, this dude's cool. I'm going to hang out with this guy. This guy's good. We're going to break bread. I'm going to bring this guy a 40 next time. And sometimes I'd roll down there when I didn't have any cash and I would just beat him at Madden and get street cred that way or whatever. Talk about girls, talk about cars, talk about the Cowboys versus the Eagles, talk about the whatever. And that's when that all comes rushing forward. It's like, this is done. Now I'm that sociopathic compartment that I put in was manifest through a contrived process, and now I'm me again and just looking at these people like people, and it was terrible.
What was terrible? Tell me about that. Tell me more. What you learned from that terrible emotion that you were feeling?
So it kind of solidified the fact that we are so much alike. I think you would get most reasonable people in the middle to agree that, hey, it doesn't matter what race you are, it doesn't matter what culture you are, we've got a lot in common. But most of us would agree, if you're a violent criminal, then no, there's not so much in common. This is one of the key things that I learned was these are violent criminals, but that is, like anything else, only a piece of their personality. They turn it into a culture because it's something that you can't be a violent criminal and then just turn it off and then pretend everything's fine. So you assimilate into something. But when you really dig down into their personality and figure out who they are and what they aspire to do and everything, you recognize how disadvantaged they are and how misguided they are to think that this is a pinnacle. Moreover, when it got wrapped up, I lost control of what I was doing. So I had
Mm.
full, absolute autonomy to go out, meet people, learn about where they're connected gang wise, make a case, not make a case, whatever. I had autonomy to just run amok and do the right thing. Once the U.S. Attorney's Office takes over and these guys start going to trial, all I can do is have a list in my mind like, oh man, I hope he talks. Because if he does, I'm going to testify on his behalf for his character because I want him to make it. I hope he gets the less amount of time. I hope this guy skates. I hope, because once it's over, I have favorite people and I have people that are scary and should never get out. But I have other people that I'm like, man, I'm like wishing the best for them, but I'm no
Wow.
longer in control of what they're doing. And some of them it was the gambit. Some of them would be like,
did you testify for some people for some of them for their character?
yeah,
The ones
actually, yeah, four people actually took me up on that, and I think a lot of other people started kind of trying to come back and say, "Wait, I want to come back and talk about this deal again," because I didn't like all of them, mind you, but there was a select handful, a reasonable number of people that I felt like deserved some time, but nothing that was going to be a life changing event. So I did. I testified on behalf of four different people on their character and that I thought they had social redeeming value and that they could be a success if given an opportunity to not spend 20 years in prison, which is about the average that most of these guys did.
Man, my mind is blown. I have so many questions. So I think I'm going to ask this thing through the eyes of your wife. If I were to ask your wife, Holly, how did Tegan do it and how did it change him? What would she tell me?
For the most part, I think she's just proud that I was able to do something for a righteous reason and do something that was super hard. But it's a reciprocating admiration because I'm not the kind of guy that's like, hey, I'm the man of the house and I run things, and then I admire her because she supports me. Because we support each other. And the fact is, I don't know if I could have done it backward or not, because she would literally stay. Well, I mean, I couldn't be, if she were doing the undercover work and I was holding down a regular job and trying to watch her go in and out at 2 a.m. and going off places. I don't know. I mean, I don't think I could have handled it. I would have had to like, hey, I'm drawing a line, dude, So part of what she did as part of her, I don't know if you call it her personality or what, but I would get a call and somebody would say, man, I'm just, picked up a load. We're coming up from Waco. I'll be up in a couple hours and, you want to meet up, blah, blah, blah. And like I said, I had the autonomy. So I would just get up and go. I didn't have like cover teams and all that kind of stuff. I wasn't wired and all that. I would literally just get up because there was nobody really in charge of me, which is happenstance. I can explain later, but I would get up, out of bed, and she'd be like, where are you going? I'm so I got to go do this deal with B, just call this guy or whatever. And so I'm going to go link up and see if I can get something done. And so she would get up. Despite my protest, she would get up out of bed and go sit on the living room couch and turn on the TV until I got home because she's not going to sleep.
Really?
Yeah. So I'd come home, it'd be 5:30 in the morning, and then she'd go grab a 45 minutes of sleep and then get up and shower and go to a job.
Wow.
So she was a stud. And she was also, like I said, too, she was the one that could recognize the small things that were biting at me I think my personality was less changed in terms of coming home and talking hood, although I did pick up some of that stuff. That was less of the problem, more so than just the stress of knowing the entire case was resting on how do I succeed in this next part, or if I was running into wrinkles. It was hard to just be home and then be free of all of it when I know that I have to be up the next day down there and fixing problems that are not just normal problems. These are gangster problems, and I have to be gangster in the way that I handle the problems. So it's outside of the scope of my natural personality. I'm dealing with problems in ways that I would never in my personal life deal with problems. So she's proud of the perseverance. And I think she would also highlight the same thing that I told you about when I went into undercover work, that I kind of get along with everybody.
What about your son? How did that affect your relationship with your son? Just as soon as I became a father, first, I couldn't understand how the world operated. Like, how is the world operating when your heart is in a child running around? And I have not watched a movie about anything with a child being injured or sick, or like I can't even entertain a movie about that subject because it's too vulnerable and scary for me.
Yeah.
You have an 11 and you are deep undercover, and it's dangerous. Right.
Yeah.
And you mentioned it's gangster, and you had to deal with gangster problems in gangster ways. I mean, how did you navigate that?
The fact that he didn't have a lot of questions, when you're 10 and 11, you're just kind of, I mean, he was into his sports and his friends and, doing all this stuff in it. And, it's nobody was asking me what's going on or anything. And I was in an environment that was completely different than home or work. So it was almost like the greatest escape ever, when I was having those times. I felt like it was an easy transition to hanging out with him and feeling like I was just dad again.
Were you ever worried about getting killed on the job?
Yeah. Yeah.
So how do you balance that with having a kid? How were you able to compartmentalize that?
Well, first of all, I think I knew it was risky, but I didn't think I was going to die other than a couple of instances that happened that I couldn't have prepared for that just made me freak out about it. And then it kind of, ended up being something that I had to navigate around every time I went to go do other deals. But in terms of that, I think a lot of it had to do with, again, compartmentalizing and remembering what the goal is. The fact is, there's on the same street that I'm pulling down to go to this gang lieutenant's house is a grandmother with 4 grandkids. She's already raised kids. Now she's raising more kids. And those kids can't go outside and play. I mean, it's a freaking hellhole over there. So it was still kind of for the sake of the people trying to do right. I just felt like, if somebody has to do this, and what's fascinating about it to me in retrospect is that, my son was kind of volunteered for it, being a part of this that he never signed up for. My wife signed up for it, understood it. But, by the time this thing blew up into something as big as it ended up being, I mean, even extended family were feeling impacts from it. I that's the only thing I can think is that's the reason I ignored danger in certain instances, why I stayed calm, because I'm playing a role, and I think guys are better at compartmentalizing things anyway. Sure. Sometimes it's advantageous, other times it's really disadvantageous, and I think in this case I used it to my benefit. And there are other times where I compartmentalize things that I probably need to deal with. I didn't let myself think as deeply as you're suggesting. I don't think I let myself go there.
Because if you did, you probably wouldn't be able to operate.
Yeah, absolutely not. Yeah, absolutely not.
Wow.
Because you're right. I'm the same way as you are. I mean, you have this kid my entire life, and my goals changed. My kid even brought it up. He was probably 18 or 19, and we were having a talk, and I said, yeah, I was going to do this or this or this. But then when we had you, blah, 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 he's like, oh man, I'm sorry. You quit music and then you were going to do DEA, but now I was like, no, you don't understand. It's not a sacrifice I made. You changed the goal,
Right.
You have plans for life. And then the punch in the face is the kid. You're like, okay, well, my goals have changed now, because so it wasn't that I had to sacrifice as much as I just had to change what I'm going to do on this trajectory to raising you, which is my number one priority now.
Well, was it just because you had how many arrests in Fishbowl? Was it 51, 52?
51, yeah.
51. And then I have a number here. I don't know if it's correct, but I have a number like 104 kids then were left without parents from those arrests. Is that correct?
Right.
And then your profits from your book and a lot of your work you support is, I think we have one program, is it called FAME? FAME, which is supporting, a lot of the profits go to supporting kids who have parents who are incarcerated, right?
I met a dude who was associated with the Texas Rangers baseball club. I'd gone out and thrown out a first pitch as part of we found out who you are. Come throw out the first pitch. And this guy has a side conversation with me. He says, have you ever met this guy, Gary Randall? And he introduces me to this guy who's running a program on the outskirts of where I'd been operating this entire time. Didn't even know about it. It's 2 old dope houses that he purchased, refurbished, put a playground out there. It's an after-school program that mentors children of incarcerated and murdered parents. I was like, dude, that's right in my hood. It's incredible. So I said, well, this is something I want to support, because this organization actually serves the actual kids that are left behind. Because once you get done and you look at this whole thing and you try to feel like, how do I wrap my mind around this? Did I do right? You have to make the arrest. You have to get the violent people off the street. But it's the same thing that people propose to me now. Like, hey, you got these operators in your company. Let's go rescue these sex trafficked women from these locations. Whereas, okay, well, what then? Because that doesn't solve anything other than getting them out for a couple of weeks before they get right back in, because it's a circumstance that is cyclical. So it's the same thing with these violence. So I discovered by talking to this guy how incredibly difficult it is to just take these groups of people, arrest them, have the 104 kids there, and then guess what? Teach a cop how to go undercover in 20 years and arrest all of these kids. I was like, well, I'm only doing half of the job. The other half still remains to be seen. And that's what was the motivation to even write the book and get the story out there was, man, we can contribute to these programs that are actually mentoring these kids. This particular organization was teaching them everything from their scholastic stuff to art to table manners to how to dress in an interview, how to shake a firm handshake and look someone in the eye. I mean, things that a lot of kids that grow up without a father don't learn. So, you stop the cycle, then the purpose changes again. New level.
But we talk about like your sense of your connection with your son and the importance of him and how you were able to compartmentalize and the importance of that. How do you deal with your feeling that now there's 104 kids whose parents are incarcerated? Do you feel guilty for that? I mean, do you feel not guilty? Yeah. How does that guilt come up? How do you, you look at the end
absolutely.
goal? I know, but tell me about that.
Yeah.
What's a inner dialogue with yourself?
Yeah. It's not insulting at all. It's a great question, because it is, it's introspective. And when I learned that, I didn't know how many kids we had, but after that talk with Gary Randall, I thought, man, this program is perfect. I feel like I could help contribute to this and close the gap between that cycle. This takes care of kids from 5 through high school, but they start early, because that's where you're the most emotional and impressionable and everything else. I've got one half of the arrest and a quarter of the kids, taking them in a direction where they see a ceiling is high. Some of these guys in their debrief, we would just talk about, where are you from? Your parents, blah, blah, blah. We get kind of a bio workup. And like I said, some of them will come up with kids and, they say, well, I've got, 3 kids and they're all born last year. And this, what are their names? And, you get some of those circumstances. Some of them had, kids that were named after gangs, It's just sad, sick stuff sometimes. But it made me go back and literally count and find out more details. And that's where the 104 kids came from. The only thing that kept me from feeling guilty, I think it was the opposite. I think, when we arrested him, I felt guilty because I really loved a bunch of these dudes and I hated to see them go away, but I knew it was the right thing. When I realized those kids were there, I saw an opportunity to funnel the attention that this case was getting into those programs and complete that cycle. We're like, man, if we could just, this is the way we keep this from happening again, which is kind of, wasn't part of the North Star throughout the entire operation. The North Star was to salvage that neighborhood. We did that, great. But long term, what's the big picture? That's how you fix it. And so it was exciting to me, really, when I found out, wow, we have this many kids that can now be served, and I know where they can be served. This is the universal solution. This is amazing.
So let me play back what I'm hearing, or what's coming through for me from what I'm hearing. you're in the situation, you get to know these men, and you start realizing that you like them. And some of them, you see the sociopathic level that they have in terms of how they deal with certain things and such. But some of them you like, some of them you hang out with, some of them you relate to in a deep level, that even to the point that you'll testify for a few of them to credit their oath of character, like their character, right? But you also realize that they're cyclical here. There's like cycles here that are bigger than just them. They're like living within a system and living within an environment. Then the arrests come and you realize here's 104 kids. The question is, how do we stop those 104 kids become 20 years from now the next ones who get arrested?
Exactly.
Like, how do I, when you say complete the cycle, you mean how do I stop that vicious cycle and create a new one?
Right. Exactly.
Create a
stop
new
the cycle of stop the cycle of violence.
So you felt guilty. In some sense, you get guilty for putting away the people that you liked because they lived in certain environments and they took certain violent action and such. But for the kids, you didn't feel guilty. You felt opportunity and excitement. You're like, we can stop. This is, and you didn't realize that while you were doing the undercover thing. It happened only after.
Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, I didn't, because I didn't spend a lot of time with the kids.
Are you worried about revenge or retribution? Are you worried about that? I mean, you're doing podcasts. You wrote a book. You're putting yourself out there.
Yeah.
How does that equate?
So there was, most of the threats and death threats came during the arrests, and they were mostly directed from guys that were inside telling people outside to launch the threats, or family members and things like that. Then it kind of quelled a little bit. I still have the same exact phone number, by the way. So I was like, I want to know if these are coming or not. So I still have the same digits I did back in those days. But once it kind of quelled, and Holly wouldn't stay at home alone, and so we'd go driving around as just Holly and Aiden and I would go somewhere, and if I had to do like some overnight gig or something, they would just sleep in my truck with a TV plugged in, the cigarette lighter or something. But it quelled over time because these guys were locked away and the family threats had gone. And then comes the cycle of time where they start trickling out. And that was more of a significant thing. So ironically, all those fools read that book in prison.
Really?
They've all read it. Yes. For the
first, about them.
My hope was then that once they read it, they realize this is about their own kids and keeping people from doing what they did. And unless you get out, which I will say, there have been a handful that got right out as freaking 40-somethings, 50-somethings, and start right back to gangbanging, which I think is ludicrous. But most of them, I think you spend 23, 24 years in federal prison. When you get out and you're an older dude, you would think you're going to try to find something else to do. And in doing so, they have also an appreciation for, would I want my kid to do this and then go to prison and whatever? Because that's just part of it.
What was the thing that ended that 13-year chapter? Was it that operation that you felt, like what internally in was happening in your life that you said, okay, I think this chapter's over?
Well, like I said, the emotional toil was more than I was ready for.
But let's talk about that for a second. The emotional toil, felt some guilt because you like these guys, but then you're saying it's not personal. So does that mean like it's not personal, but yet you can still feel the guilt and still feel the emotion of that, or what?
Yeah.
What was so emotional?
I mean,
because you're so good at compartmentalizing too. So
yeah, but again, it was the end, so there was no more purpose behind compartmentalizing anything. It was emotionally draining as well as just physically. It just took me a while to even get motivated to do anything else, because I kept thinking, just imagine the level of heightened awareness and excitement that happens on a daily basis for that long a period. And then all of a sudden you go back to, all right, well, you're going to report to your boss and then go out and do police work. I don't know. I mean, I had no desire. So I even talked to my wife, is like,
right.
Yeah. I literally had stepped off about 3 months before the economy took its first major crash in 2008, and started a company with no money and just started doing all the work myself. And just, the hustle mode was easy for me. I was in hustle mode in the music industry, was in hustle mode doing my undercover work and starting a business. Half of it is your refusal to say no and learn and keep standing up and wiping the dirt off your knees. And the other half is having the education and the know-how so that some of the mistakes that you make aren't going to be fatal ones.
Right.
And so that's all I did was just dive into the education about leadership and business and how to sustain a company. We started picking up some billionaire clients and protection stuff. And then people thought it was so cool because like, man, you must be in all these crazy protection classes and all this stuff. I'm like, are you kidding me? That's where I'm sending my people.
Right. So you have 19 years of that business, but at what point did you step off of that and let that chapter kind of where it demanded less of you and now enabled you to move to this fourth chapter of storytelling, writing, creativity?
Yeah, I think most people will say this first few years are, I think are the most unappreciable years when you start a business. Everybody wants to be an entrepreneur, start a business. I'm like, then they get tired working 10-hour days. I'm like, 10-hour days. I mean,
that's easy. That's nothing.
It's ridiculous. Yeah.
But I mean, isn't that what Deep Cover? Deep Cover, the same thing. That wasn't a 10-hour day, right? Even when you go home, you're still thinking about it and, talking about taking work to home. I mean,
it's super long, weird hours. And you're right. But you just have to be, it takes a unique person to do it because it is such an extraordinary amount of work, but you don't think of it like work. You are compelled to fix a problem or compelled to figure out how this is going to work or compelled to learn this. So this, and you just spend 24/7. And that was a whole nother chapter, in Holly and I's life, building that company up. But then it, as it grew and it kind of settles a little bit, I think close to COVID is when, along with everybody else, you start kind of reframing the things you're doing. It was leading up to COVID. I was writing some more music. As the book became more popular, we had some meetings with, it started with Scotty Bernstein out in LA, who just finished doing Straight Outta Compton. And we were taking meetings with him and talking about, how we could incorporate the music into my own show. And then it turned from a movie script into a series script because that's where everything was going. And then right when 2020 hit, he was working on the Aretha movie. And so, my thing got kind of sidelined. And I just decided to just kind of let it roll.
In the questionnaire, which I was, thank you for filling that out, but that gives me a lot of information.
Cool.
And insight is like, one of your top one that you write. The first one is I say, please tell me a motto or saying that you find yourself using in your life. And the first one you write is, two opposing thoughts or ideas can be held true at once. Both can be true.
Yeah.
Right? Both can be valid. And I think we live in a time where actually that's not cultivated. We live in a time where everyone is like, nope, this is, ironically, we live like in a post-truth era where everyone has their own truth and yet no one's really acknowledging the fact that other people have a right to have their own truth or like your POV. And I think it seems to, so, but it also seems to me like you move in like 13, 14-year cycles because you're now 19 years in the business, but like, COVID kind of started shifting that 6 years ago. It's like 13 years of that. You still have the company, you're still part of it, but you've kind of launched into this new chapter.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. A lot of what I brought back though are retroactively triggering things. Like even writing the book was educational for me, and then being present, writing the scripts for the movie or for the series or whatever, and then being hired as a writer for the SoFrep stuff and being on a schedule to write 3 times a week and everything is maybe want to focus on writing and stuff too. It's fascinating that a lot of the stuff has kind of come back. It's not necessarily something brand new. It's kind of leveraging a lot of different things that I already have spent those years in myopic hell developing that now I can do with ease and comfort and enjoyment more, in my disposition now. The thing that I think not enough people recognize early enough, which is when they say youth is wasted on the young, which is kind of part of this manifest, is that once you live your life in a way that you see outside of yourself and try to pursue things that are for the benefit of other people, it changes your perspective on everything. And it's more rewarding. I don't know how many people will see this, but if it's one girl that heard the part about Holly or whatever, and it's life changing or makes them think differently about something, it's worth all the effort. And I think you would say the same thing. It's the same reason you do it. You teach people to think deeper, and that's my whole premise. Is I want people to take situations that they're used to seeing and registering in a singular way, that is just, this is just what happens. I see this and that means X, Y. And I said, well, what if you thought of it like this? And I'm taking experiences from my life as an old man now, where I was working undercover with people who saw the same situation from a complete polar opposite direction, or the music business for all these crazy people, or you're in a startup where you're having to figure out how to lead different people into different ways and to let them feel like they're accomplishing things. I mean, it's everything is just a matter of sharing things that I think are valuable that I would have loved to have picked up when I was 30.
On that note, what do you feel life has designed you for? What have you seen or experienced that gives you that idea? That tells you that?
I really do think it is for sharing the betterment of myself to secure the betterment of others. I mean, it really is kind of that. I mean, I've spent years hyper focused on myself, and I'm going to do this business. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do whatever it is. And it's all about me. I'm getting better at this. I'm going to succeed at this. And, have people, I think Holly was a significant part of my life that she's such a giving person. She didn't measure whether or not it was inconvenient, how often they asked for things or any of that. There's none of that weighing back and forth. And that's why I think I've been able to take the experiences in my life, and including our marriage, and reciprocate to life in that way. I think the things that you're good at and the things that you've learned from, if you don't share it, what's the point? It's going to turn to dirt. Most people, I think, feel like giving is conditional. That's the root cause of most of the problem. If you give unconditionally, you've got to be as giving as your puppy dog and not expect anything back. And I think too many people expect something back subconsciously. They just, once they've done 5 things in a row, they're like, dude, this is the 5th time in a row I've done anything. You don't do anything for me. So if you base your life on non-reciprocal giving, you'll find that these things start falling in place, whether it be opportunities or people's lives that you can touch or whatever. It's miraculous when you think that way.
Great. And I want to unpack that, because there's a lot in what you put in the questionnaire and what we've spoken about that's connected to this statement. So how did you learn that?
I don't want to imply that, you can't be like a nice, generous person and not still have that wall. I mean, I think there's a limit to everybody. If we really think about it, there's probably a limit to everybody, because I also have a prioritization schedule in my mind where if somebody's really not receiving anything that I'm giving, I will move on. But it's not, that's not, I'm asking for them to give me something. I just feel like this is so far of a wall in the middle of us that it's not worth 10 times the effort. I can touch 10 other people, right?
Which is great. That you have a saying here that I love. I've never heard this in my life, but I love it. He says, I asked you to tell me some of your mottos. This other one is, a bee doesn't waste its time trying to convince the fly that honey is sweeter than shit. I love that. A bee doesn't waste its time trying to convince the fly that honey is sweeter than shit. Some people are just not worth your energy. That's what you're alluding to here. Like sometimes there's a wall where just like, okay, there's no point here. I gotta.
Right. And I don't want to. And so by that, I'm not insinuating that you should be giving to the extent that you're just exhausted and feel like there's no movement. There is within reason. And I think I think in a nutshell, that explains American politics for the last 10 years. But even when I was young, I got along with everybody. I felt like I was a giving and receiving person or whatever, but not to the extent that it was an enlightening experience. I think Holly was the beginning of it for sure. Because again, at that point, I had just entered law enforcement and I was in dive-in mode. I probably was 2.5 years into law enforcement or something at that time, and was just diving into it, learning and trying to read all the real life books that I could and figure out all these different things. Self-serving, reasonable to understand now how that plays. But you have to have something to give in order for it to be valuable. So I also need to leave that caveat there, is like you definitely need to pour into yourself when you're young, so that before you're too old to express it or share it, you need to be able to share something that's valuable. And sometimes the most valuable things can just be sharing the failures. There's things that I would go back and change, in my life, but a lot of the failures I wouldn't, because I think we hinted towards this early on, is that you learn the most from your worst experiences. If it doesn't kill you, at least you're like, wow, this pissed me off more than anything, or whatever. And you'll never forget it because of the impact that it had, because of the severity of the failure or whatever. So, I mean, those are types of things you can share too. It's not like you have to have some major success story. Everybody has something that they could share in a generous way. You don't have to have some kind of stellar, career or whatever. And I think that's really where the trap is too, because it's another thing I've learned is if you're fortunate enough to get to be old, you're going to look back and you're going to feel like you've done things in your life that are great achievements, but it doesn't necessarily mean you leave at the pinnacle of whatever that is. And there is a struggle to kind of maintain an identity outside of vocation or a particular accomplishment, but it's important. And I think by sharing, you find that the meaning of sharing with other people, empowering other people, helping other people on their feet is a much greater feat than, any kind of, Super Bowl win or whatever. You took it to the nth degree. Well, what job are you going to do now that's going to beat that? Not many. But you can't be hung up on that, because that's where a lot of us get stuck. We're like, well, what can I do to even do better than that? And the answer is to start seeing outside of yourself, because that's where you get hung up anyway. You're trying to find an identity. You're still looking inside that whole time. And my situation with observing how Holly was such a giving person, and then going through Fishbowl and recognizing how similar those people were and how much more they could have achieved had they had an opportunity, and then going back retroactively and helping the kids that were left behind and stopping over their extended family members' houses and dropping off Christmas stuff, or whatever way you manifest all that stuff, or somebody calling and saying, I'd love to talk about how you got into business. Would you be willing to mentor me, or whatever?
Yeah.
The opportunities are everywhere.
That's beautiful. So life has designed you to offer your gifts to others, to share.
Yeah.
What is the gift that you feel is, carried through all your chapters? Is it the myopic ability to super hyper focus on something and dive deep and go all the way? Or is it the empathy? Like, I hear your ability to be friends and like connect with many different people. What would you say is your gift?
I think if you had to sum it up, it would be perspective, because it's just a way to, like I said, to take something that you're used to seeing one way and make a concerted effort to see it differently. And if you don't move to the next thing, but try to see it differently, it's enlightening, and it helps you to share things. That'll give you all of the ammunition you need to go share something significant with someone else. Even this story, we talk about Fishbowl, it's, these are people that I adored, and it's freaking weird to even say it. They're like, what? I mean, you have to kind of go through those stages to even understand why, but it forces you to look at what you're doing differently. And I think the more we do that, first of all, it's an intelligent thing to do, because especially in an age of information access, I mean, we kind of everything, starting with your fact checking, but certainly your emotional fact checking. And then it gives you ways to touch more people.
What do you mean the emotional fact checking?
Well, a lot of people will take on a clump of information based on where it came from, and not what the information is.
I see. So you mean that their emotional fact checking mean they're taking facts from a place and not because it like resonates with them emotionally, not because it's necessarily a true fact.
Exactly. And it's almost I would say it almost resonates more with people because it's emotionally charged. But the recognition that, wait, this is my emotion triggering, not my logic triggering, should make you say, let me try to investigate the other side. I mean, there's people, we're working in an algorithmic world. So people don't even feel like there's another side that makes sense, because if you take some of the politically charged things and you start clicking on those and liking on those, then I'll be damned. Look at that. All you get are extreme goofyisms on the other side, and this all makes sense, and there's more of us on this side. And then you don't even have an opportunity to see a reasonable source on the other side explain it differently, because the algorithm's just feeding you. It's inadvertent, but it happens to all of us. So you have to literally make a concerted effort to say, I feel like this is true, and that's the place where I'm in the most danger. Because if I think it's true, I could ride this out and spread something that's actually not true. And it's not fair to myself either. So challenge something that's significant that you feel like, well, this is what I think is absolutely the case. You have to actually seek it purposefully to find other information. I want reasonable explanations to the contrary in order for me to feel like I can justify that. And that also plays into your intuition and everything else, because your intuitive sense is a survival skill. But if your intuitive sense is all based on emotional garbage that you consider fact, then you're also going to respond to that. And that's going to end up getting you killed instead of save you.
What keeps you up these days?
Probably the same thing that's always kept me up, which is my brain is just constantly trying to find the next thing to learn or leverage. And that sounds like I'm going back to my self-serving days or whatever, but it is it really, at this point, I feel like the more I can learn, the more I can offer. So I have a kind of a different motivation. Obviously, I've always wanted to learn anyway, but I learn with something more interesting. If I can have this conversation over a couple of whiskeys with my buddies and get their take on it or whatever, or try to experiment with different ideas.
I know we've gone over, so we just end all our sessions on a self. This one is a self deck, which is actually one of my favorites because it's about questions to ask yourself. So you're gonna tell me when to stop, and you just we don't have to answer it. We don't have to answer the question, but we'll just ask it, and it usually it's interesting. It's kind of question it's a question posed to yourself. Here we go. Would you like, I have two house of decks in my hand right here. Do you want the right hand or the left hand?
Your left hand.
Left hand. Okay. And then I'm going to flick through it. Tell me when to stop. Hold on a sec. Here we go. Tell me when to stop. Here you go.
Stop.
Here's the question.
All right.
I'll put it up to you. I don't know what the question is, but you can tell me what does it say?
Oh, shit.
You see that? What does it say? Oh my!
Describe what you want to enter your life. Is that what it says?
Be as detailed as possible. Yeah, be as detailed as possible. Describe what you want to enter your life. Be as detailed as possible.
Man, I mean, this is I'm gonna end up with a cheesy answer, I'm sure, but probably to an extent. And I say this on purpose, a ceiling, but enlightenment is kind of what we're all seeking, really. I just know that there has to remain an appreciation for the mysterious, and I mean that in a lot of different ways, whether they're different topics or experiences or people that could come in and enlighten your life or any of that. I think that's really what I want to come in. And a lot of the best things are happenstance, which is why I think that would be the best way to put it. If that answers the question reasonably without sounding like a cop-out.
That's great. Beautiful. Thank you so much for coming on.
I want to thank you for joining me in this conversation. I hope it had some utility. I hope it offered a reflection of what maybe life is shaping you for, and maybe it offered a missing piece to the puzzle of your life. It was a pleasure for me, and I appreciate your time and attention. Please subscribe to our channel so that you can stay abreast of all the new episodes we have coming out. And until next time, thank you so much.
Guts is a Skin Deep media production. The show is produced and edited by Gonzalo Torres Ocampo, with editorial support from Anthony Cabral, and executive produced by me, Topaz Adizes. Special thanks to all the guests who showed guts, without whom there will be no getting under the skin. Interested in joining our community and following this journey? Visit guts.podcast on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok, and theskindeep.com for in-depth conversation card games that create the space for connection, intimacy, and deeper conversation.